Welcome back, students. We have covered very basic parts of the inheritance till the second lecture. We have covered the basics of single inheritance. How can we derive a class from another class? And in second lecture, we have covered in detail about when you create a derived class object, how base and derived class constructor gets called. Basically, we have discussed in the second lecture about the order of their constructor calling. And at the end of the second lecture, we have also discussed in detail about the order of destructor calling. Okay, so in this lecture, what are you going to see in the this part, the new part? What are you going to see? We're going to see when we create a object of the derived class, how can we initialize the derived class member using derived class constructor, and then how can we initialize base class member using derived class constructor. So this is the thing that we're going to cover in this topic. So the in gist, what is the name of the topic that we're going to cover under this lecture? Constructors and initialization of derived class. Let's start this topic. Okay. So what we have already done, just for your revision purpose, we have explored some basic around inheritance in C++ and the order that derived classes are initialized. Okay, the order of constructors. We have mainly discussed about single inheritance. We have go with a class that I hope you remember in the very first lecture. We have discussed about person class, then we have discussed about baseball player class. Similarly, we have discussed about employee class can be derived from person class. So these are all the examples of single inheritance. We have also discussed when you create an object of derived class, how the constructor of base class get called first and it is followed to the constructor of derived class. And we have also discussed when a derived class object goes out of scope, then what are the order of calling of the destructor from base class and derived class. And at the very last part of the second lecture, we have give a just little bit introduction about multi-level inheritance, where we have followed a class hierarchy includes 4 classes. I hope you remember that diagram, class A, B, and C, and D. Okay, so this is an example of multi-level inheritance. So these are the topics that we have covered till the second lecture. So this is the part of the third lecture. Okay, and again we are going to discuss about when we create, what we're going to discuss in this lecture, when we will take a closer look at the role of constructor in the initialization of derived classes, how constructor going to help to initialize the derived class data member as well as the initialization of base class data member. So just take a simple example here. We have taken a very basic example as a base class, have only one data member and one member function and with one argument constructor with default value. Similarly, the same example we have taken one more time, derived class, deriving base class publicly. Mode of inheritance is here public. Okay. So for your understanding, I repeat one more time, public inheritance means public data member of the base class remain public inside the derived class. So like base class, derived class also have one member function called getCost, and it also has one argument parameter as constructor. Okay. Now let's assume that first we are going to create an object called obj of base class with by passing the value 10. Then what will happen? What will happen? The first step compiler will do here, it will allocate memory for base. It will allocate memory for base. The reason is that this base class is a standalone class. It doesn't depend to any other class. That means it has no parent, neither, okay, so it doesn't depend on any parent class. Okay, so we called it a standalone class here, very single class here. So memory for that object will be allocated. How much memory is required? To know this, just look at the class definition. Inside base class, we have declared one data member as integer. So how much memory is consumed by integer data member? 4 byte. So 4 byte memory will be given to the obj. And next, what will happen? The appropriate base constructor gets called. So how many constructor we have here? Actually, we have here only one constructor with default value. So we are passing that value 10 to that constructor. So which constructor gets called? The constructor that we have written here is going to call this constructor and is going to assign the value 10 to the ID of the argument of that constructor. Thereafter, what will happen? The initialization list initializes variables. Variables of what? Variables, here we call them data member of class base. So what will happen? Initialization list uses the data member name m underscore id and it get initialized by the value 10 what we have passed from the main method. Thereafter, body of the constructor gets executed. Although we did not write any line of source code inside the constructor, but still this is the procedure. After executing the initializer list of a constructor, body of the constructor needs to be executed. Then what last? Then we are calling the constructor when we creating the object. Okay, it get the implicit call, automatically constructor get called by the compiler. So now return will come back to the caller. Here caller is the main method. So in a gist, what I want to say when we create a base class object, it have no information that is there any other class in your source file who is inheriting that base class or not. It's simply going to create the object for that base class only and allocates memory for that base class only. And using constructor, it's going to initialize the data member which is belongs to that class only. Next. We are going to take the same example. Now let's see the main method. Now I have changed the main method here. Previously, we are creating the base class object. Now we are creating derived class object. Okay. So what are the steps we should follow here? Step number 1, memory for derived will be created. Now, in the previous lectures, we have discussed in detail that when we create a derived class object, first base class constructor gets called. That means a derived class object has two parts. The first part is the parent part, the second part is the child part. In this example, the derived class object derived will have the first part of the base and second it will have its own part. Now look at the constructor that you are calling while you are creating the derived class object. We are passing only one value 1.3. Okay, so it's going to call the derived class constructor here. Okay, it's going to call the derived class constructor. Before calling the derived class constructor, compiler will give you enough memory by which you can initialize, we can keep the base data member and derived data member together. Okay, so how much memory is going to allocate? For integer, it is going to allocate 4 byte, and for double, it is going to allocate 8 byte. So in a total, 12 byte of memory will be available for the derived class object. Then what next? Now see the second step, while you're creating the object, what compiler will do? Compiler is going to call the derived class, appropriate derived class constructor. So here we are calling the derived class constructor which have only one argument of type double. So it's going to call this constructor which have also one argument called cost as a default value 0.0. Now look at this. We know when you're going to call derived, it also going to call the base class constructor. But look at here, the derived class constructor doesn't have any base class constructor. We are not specifying which base class constructor we need to call. Okay, we are not specifying here. So remember, in this case, when we are not specifying any base class constructor as part of the derived class constructor, then what will happen? Then compiler going to use the default constructor, default base class constructor to initialize the base class part as part of the derived class object. So when we are going to create this object, what will happen? Compiler going to use the base class constructor, default base class constructor. Okay, because we are not providing any base class constructor here, so it's going to provide the default base class constructor, and we know what a default base class constructor can do. Default base class constructor initialize the data member with garbage values. Okay, so m underscore id as part of the derived object will have the garbage value. Okay, next, the initialization list initializes the variable. After doing this, when we call the after initialization of the base class constructor, what it will do? It's going to use the initialization list to initialize the data member. So here it's going to call the default constructor and it's going to initialize the data member here. Okay. So at last, what will happen after doing the base class? Once the base class constructor gets called, then it uses the initializer list. Just go back. Yeah, it uses the initializer list. Which initializer list? Derived class constructor initializer list to initialize the data member. Which data member? Here, data only have one data member, m underscore cost. Remember, you should remember this point. We are not calling any base class data member here, neither we are calling base class constructor. So base part of the derived object will have the garbage value, and derived class data member will be initialized by the value that we have passed 1.3. So that means m underscore cost will have the value 1.3 here. Finally, the body of the constructor gets executed and control return to the main method. So I hope you get the idea here how base class part of the derived object get initialized in this example, and how derived class constructor uses its initializer list to initialize the derived class data member. We will continue this lecture in the next video. I hope you understand the basic part here.